Watch the face. That was the whole trick of it. When you wanted to know a man, you didn't listen to his words. Words were cheap. Words were rehearsed. You watched what his face did in the half-second before he remembered to control it. Alessandro Vitale had spent his life reading faces, and the one across the table from him now was doing something interesting. On my life, Alessandro. Danny Cruz had both hands flat on the table, the picture of an honest man. I would never skim from you. 15 years. My kids call you uncle. Rain moved down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, 41 stories above the Chicago River, and the city smeared into ribbons of wet gold below. Two of Alessandro's men stood in the corners of the room. Danny sat in the chair, and Alessandro sat very still, watching the man's face, and felt the familiar nothing settle over him like dust. Because here was the thing about Danny Cruz's face. It was doing exactly what an innocent man's face should do. The right amount of fear, the right amount of hurt. The tremor in the lip, the wet shine in the eyes, the hands held open and trembling. It was a perfect performance of innocence. And that was the problem. Alessandro had sat in this chair across from perhaps 100 men over the years, and he had learned that the truly innocent were almost never this good at looking innocent. Real innocence was clumsy. It got angry. It got confused. It said the wrong thing. This seamlessness was the work of a man who had practiced, or the work of a man who was simply, honestly terrified, because he knew that Alessandro Vitale had put a bullet through people for less than what he stood accused of. That was the trouble with fear. It made the innocent look guilty and gave Alessandro nothing to hold. $2.4 million, Alessandro said quietly. His voice was a low, controlled thing. He never raised it, never had to. It has left Meridian Logistics over 11 months. In amounts small enough to look like rounding. Someone inside my building did this, Danny. Someone with access. Someone patient. It isn't me. Danny's voice cracked on the word. It was a good crack. It was almost too good. Alessandro looked at him for a long moment. Then he lifted 2 fingers, and his men stepped forward and lifted Danny out of the chair, but gently, and Danny felt the gentleness and dared, for the first time, to hope. Go home to your kids, Alessandro said. If you're clean, you have nothing to fear from me. If you're not, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. When the door closed behind the weeping man, Tomas emerged from the shadows near the window. 60, silver-haired, the only man alive permitted to tell Alessandro he was wrong. Was it him? Tomas asked. I don't know. And that was the thing that gnawed at Alessandro. He always knew. That was the whole engine of his power. He read men correctly. He acted first. He was never surprised. But for 11 months, a ghost had been walking through his own building, taking his money in careful little slices. And Alessandro Vitale, who could look at a man's hands and know if he'd slept the night before, could not see the ghost's face. Then we do this the loud way, Tomas said. Pull every executive, pull the managers, squeeze until someone bleeds the truth. No, Alessandro was watching the rain again. The moment I send men through that building asking questions, the thief goes still. He buries the money in a hole I'll never find, and he waits me out for a year, 2 years, however long it takes. Fear makes people careful. He turned. I don't want him careful. I want him comfortable. I want to stand in the room while he thinks no one important can see him and watch what his face does. Tomas frowned. You can't stand in that room. The second Alessandro Vitale steps off the elevator, the whole floor freezes. Everyone performs. You'd learn nothing. Something moved behind Alessandro's eyes, then something Tomas had not seen in a very long time. Not calculation. Something closer to hunger, and just beneath it, something closer to exhaustion. Alessandro Vitale. Yes. A pause. But no one performs for the man who empties their trash. There is an exhaustion that money cannot outrun. Alessandro had felt it rising in him for years, the way water rises behind a dam. Every person who spoke to him was performing. Every smile was a line item. Danny Cruz weeping in that chair, even if Danny was innocent. He'd wept because he was afraid, not because he was hurt. And Alessandro could no longer remember the last time someone had reacted to him as anything other than a threat or a bank. He was 44 years old, and he could not recall a single human being in 20 years who had been kind to him without knowing his name. He told himself the disguise was strategy, and it was. He was very good at telling himself things that were true and leaving out the part underneath. The old man who shuffled into the Meridian Logistics Tower that Monday wore grey coveralls a size too large, scuffed boots, and reading glasses low on his nose. His badge said Alfera. A film artist Tomas trusted had spent 3 sessions on him, grey in the hair, a prosthetic thickening of the nose and jaw that changed the whole architecture of the face, a stoop that took 4 inches off his height and, more importantly, took every ounce of danger out of his silhouette, a slight limp, hands that stage makeup had roughened, and that the work itself would soon roughen for real. Alessandro Vitale owned the building. Now he mopped it. The disguise worked more completely than he'd expected, and not only on his skin. Within a single day, he understood something about his own kingdom that no report had ever managed to tell him. To almost everyone in it, he had become invisible. Executives stepped around him the way they'd step around a wet floor sign. He held elevator doors and got no thanks. He wiped up spilled coffee while the man who spilled it kept talking into his phone, 6 inches from Alessandro's bent head, discussing a woman he was cheating on his wife with. People revealed themselves to those they believed powerless. Alessandro learned more true things about the people who worked for him in 3 days at the bottom than in 3 years at the unseen top. And no one revealed less than Curtis Dolan. That was the thing that first snagged Alessandro's attention. Everyone revealed something: vanity, laziness, small cruelties, small kindnesses. Everyone leaked, except the manager of the 4th and 5th floors. Curtis Dolan was the most liked man in the building, and he had earned it honestly, or seemed to. He was 40, easy in his skin, quick with a name. He knew the name of every janitor, every temp, every security guard, and he used them. "Morning, Al," he called out on the second day, clapping Alessandro warmly on the shoulder, and Alessandro braced for the cruelty, and it did not come. "You're the new maintenance guy, right? Listen, if anybody gives you a hard time up on 4, you come find me." "Okay, we take care of each other around here." He remembered birthdays. He organized the collection when a security guard's wife got sick, and Alessandro later confirmed Curtis had quietly tripled his own contribution and told no one. He was generous with the cafeteria staff, generous with the cleaning crew, and the executives above him adored him because he made everything run smooth and made every one of them feel clever. He was, in short, the last man in the building anyone would suspect of anything, which was precisely why, on the 3rd day, Alessandro began to suspect him, because a man that uniformly liked was a man managing his image with enormous, invisible effort. And enormous, invisible effort in the service of being liked by everyone was, in Alessandro's long experience, the signature of a man who needed a great deal of goodwill in the bank to cover something he'd rather no one look at too closely. It was a thread. It was thin. Alessandro had built an empire out of threads that thin. But suspicion was not proof, and a man could not be undone by a mopping janitor's hunch. Alessandro needed the ghost to leave a footprint. And so he watched, and he waited, and he emptied the bins outside the 4th floor server closet a little more often than the schedule required, and he found himself, without quite admitting why, taking his lunch at the same time every day, in the one place in the building where the disguise unexpectedly failed. Her name was Betty. The cafeteria on the 2nd floor was supposed to be, for Alessandro, a listening post. Everyone passed through it. You could read a company's whole nervous system by watching who sat with whom. He'd gone the first day, meaning only to observe from a corner. He had not planned to be seen. "You're new," the woman behind the hot line said it warmly, not as a challenge. She was perhaps 38, soft and full-figured, with kind brown eyes and flour dusted up one rolled sleeve. Her name was stitched over her heart, Betty. She had the face of a woman who had, at some hard point in her life, decided to keep being gentle anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. "First week's the worst. You look wiped, honey." Alessandro, who was addressed by every living person as Mr. Vitale or Sir or nothing at all, did not know what to do with the word honey. "I'm all right," he said. "You're grey in the face is what you are." She was already reaching for a bowl. "Sit. Specials chicken and dumplings, and I made the batch that isn't for the vultures upstairs." She dropped her voice like they were conspiring. "The good pot. I always hold a good pot back." She ladled it deep, scraping the bottom for the thick of it, more than a portion, and set it in front of him with a hunk of bread she didn't ring up. "On the house. First week rule. My rule. I made it up, don't tell nobody. She patted the counter twice, a small percussive thing, and turned to the next person in line before he could answer. She didn't hover. She didn't want anything. She had already forgotten she'd done it. Alessandro Vitale sat in a fluorescent-lit cafeteria with a bowl of chicken and dumplings and briefly could not remember how to breathe correctly. It was not the food, though the food was better than the plated art his private chef arranged and he never tasted. It was that she had looked at a broke old man. The whole building had written off as nothing and reached for the good pot. She kept it back for the ones like the man she thought he was. That night, 41 floors above the river, Alessandro did not touch the dinner waiting for him. He sat in the dark and thought about a woman scraping the bottom of a pot for a stranger who could do nothing for her in return. He came back the next day, and the next. He told himself it was the sightlines. It was, in fact, the best surveillance position in the building, and he did watch the room, and he did learn from it. All true. But he came at the same hour every day, and he sat where he could see her, and that part had nothing to do with the thief. He'd had her file pulled that first night, a reflex he was faintly ashamed of by morning. Betty Marino was a widow. Her husband, a firefighter, had died 8 years back in a warehouse collapse on the south side. No children. She was never late. She covered other people's shifts without being asked. Twice a week, after close, she packed the day's unsold food into containers and drove it to a shelter in Pilsen, on her own time, her own gas. She earned $41,000 a year. Alessandro had spent more than that on a watch he'd worn twice. Over the following days, in the 10-minute lulls before the line filled, he did something he had not done in 20 years. He talked to her. Not much, he was still, Al Ferrer, still stooped and quiet, but Betty had a way of talking that didn't require you to hold up your end, and slowly, she drew things out of him he hadn't known were there to give. "You got family, Al?" she asked one afternoon, wiping the counter. "No," he said. And then, because her face invited honesty the way an open door invites you in out of the rain, not the kind that counts. She nodded slow, like she knew exactly what that meant and wouldn't press the bruise. "Well, you got a hot lunch and somebody who'll notice if you stop showing up. That's not nothing. Some days, that's the whole game. That's not nothing." Alessandro thought about the men who would kill for him and the men who would kill him, and the vast machine of fear and money that was his life, and thought, "No one has ever noticed whether I show up, only whether I win." "Why are you kind to me?" he asked her once. It came out too direct, almost an interrogation, old habits. "You don't know me. I'm nobody here." She stopped wiping and looked at him, really looked in a way that made him feel, for one bad second, transparent, as though the prosthetic and the grey had gone see-through. "Nobody?" She said it like the word offended her. "Honey, I buried the only person on this earth I loved. You want to know what that taught me? Everybody's dragging around a bag full of rocks nobody else can see. Everybody. And you don't get to know how heavy somebody's bag is just by looking at 'em." She shrugged, gentle. "So I just figure it's heavy. For everybody. Costs me nothing to be kind. Costs the whole world when I'm not." She went back to her wiping. And Alessandro Vitale, who had built an empire on the principle that every human being could be reduced to a set of incentives and threats, sat very still and felt the foundation of a lifelong philosophy quietly crack down the middle. He almost missed the clue when it came, because it arrived wrapped in something as ordinary as a complaint. Betty was frustrated, rare for her. She set a tray down harder than usual. "Curtis Dolan," she muttered, and then caught herself. "No, he's a sweetheart. Everybody loves him. I shouldn't. It's just she sighed. He pulled my catering contract. 6 years I've done the executive lunches for the 4th floor meetings. The real spread. The nice stuff. I take pride in it. Now he says corporate wants an outside vendor." She made air quotes with flowered fingers. "Some catering outfit. Fancy name. Costs 3 times what I charge and, honey, I've seen what they bring up. Sad little sandwiches. Half the boys come down here after to eat for real." Alessandro went still in the particular way he did when a piece slid toward a slot. "An outside vendor," he repeated, keeping his voice flat, keeping the stoop. "Meridian Provisions. Something like that. Real corporate sounding." She rolled her eyes, then softened, apologetic. "He got a little funny when I asked about it, is all. Told me to mind my station, nice about it, but firm. I shouldn't complain. He does a lot of good around here. She shook it off. Feeding people right just matters to me, that's all. She went back to work, the complaint already forgotten. She had no idea she had just handed the most dangerous man in Chicago the first true footprint of the ghost he'd been hunting for 11 months. Because here was what Betty could not know. An inflated vendor contract, run through a corporate-sounding shell, was the single most common way a trusted man skimmed money without ever touching the accounts he was trusted to guard. You didn't hack the ledger. You invented a supplier, approved its invoices with your own clean signature, and pocketed the gap between what you paid it and what it actually delivered. It was invisible precisely because it looked like ordinary business. And the man who could quietly kill the cafeteria's real, cheap, honest catering to make room for it, the man with the authority to sign, was the floor manager. Curtis Dolan, the most liked man in the building, the last man anyone would look at twice. But a name and a hunch were not proof. And Alessandro had learned long ago that a man like Curtis, a man who had built 11 months of flawless theft on a foundation of universal goodwill, would not be undone by a suspicion. He had to be undone by his own hand. This was the part the reports never captured, the part that made Alessandro Vitale what he was, not the violence, but the patience beneath it. That night, the stooped shoulders straightened in the empty penthouse. Meridian Provisions, he told Tomas. It's a vendor billing the front company. I want it pulled apart. Every invoice. Who owns it? Who signs for it? And this matters what it actually delivered against what it billed. Match the delivery logs to the loading dock cameras. I want to know which invoices were paid for food that never came through the door. It took his forensic people 2 days, because Curtis had been careful. Meridian Provisions LLC was a nesting doll, one shell owned by another, owned by a third. Each in a different state, each with a plausible little cover. On paper, it was clean. It was the kind of structure that had let the money bleed for 11 months, while an entire tower of accountants saw nothing. But paper was only half of it. Alessandro's people did what a routine audit never would. They laid the vendor's invoices beside the loading dock camera footage, day by day. And the gap opened up like a wound. Meridian Provisions had billed for 240 catered executive lunches. The dock cameras, Alessandro's own building, Alessandro's own cameras, showed a delivery van arriving for barely 80 of them. The other 160 lunches had been invoiced, approved, and paid for food that had never existed. Betty's sad little sandwiches were the 80 real ones. The rest was pure theft, laundered through a fake company, signed for by a single clean hand. They pulled the bank's signature card from the innermost shell, 3 layers deep, past every firewall of plausible deniability, on the one document that mattered. Curtis M. Dolan. Alessandro looked at the name on the screen for a long time. He'd been right, the most liked man in the building. The generosity, the remembered birthdays, the triple donation for the sick guard's wife, none of it fake, exactly, and all of it in service of the same thing. A reservoir of goodwill so deep that no one would ever think to look at Curtis Dolan and see a thief. He'd made himself beloved so that he could make himself invisible. It was, Alessandro thought, genuinely well done. He'd hunted worse men who'd hidden less carefully. He should have felt the cold, clean satisfaction of the hunt ending. Instead, he felt something more dangerous, rising slow and hot. Curtis hadn't only stolen from him. He'd killed the one thing Betty was proud of: her work, her real food, her place, and killed it specifically. Because her honest, cheap catering was the only thing standing in the ledger where his fake, expensive one needed to be. He'd stepped on her to cover his own hand. That, somehow, Alessandro found harder to forgive than the 2.4 million. He didn't move at once. The trap had to be airtight. Curtis would be handed, cleanly and completely, to the kind of authorities Alessandro occasionally found it useful to feed, and it would stick, and Curtis would go to prison the ordinary way, which for a man who prized being liked was its own particular hell. But patience is a hard thing to keep when the person you've begun, against every instinct, to care about walks into the blast radius. Because Curtis Dolan had noticed the old janitor. It happened on a Thursday, near the 4th floor server closet, and the mask Curtis wore for the whole building was not the face Alessandro saw now. There was no audience in the corridor. Curtis had come with 2 of the floor's security men, and his voice had gone quiet, and ugly and real, and Alessandro understood that he was finally, for the first time, seeing the actual man beneath the generosity. "You've been asking about the vendors." Curtis stepped in close. He was sweating, a frightened man, and frightened men are the most dangerous kind, because Curtis had begun to sense that his flawless 11 months had drawn some kind of eye. Betty's little pet, poking around the 4th floor. "You want to be careful, old man. Old men slip. Old men take a bad fall down a stairwell and nobody thinks twice, because who even notices a man like you?" He jabbed one finger into Alfera's chest. "You'd be gone, and it'd be a week before anybody asked where the mop went." For one held breath, the disguise nearly failed. Alessandro Vitale had ended men for laying a hand on him. The instinct came up like a tide to catch the finger, break it backward, and let Curtis look into the eyes of the man he was threatening and understand, in the last clear seconds before the fear took him, precisely whose building he'd been robbing. He did not out of mercy, out of discipline, the kind that had kept him alive for 44 years. To end it here, in a hallway, in a flush of rage, was amateur. It would blow the trap and let a careful thief bury the money for good. And beneath the discipline, quieter and far more disturbing to him, was a second reason. If he broke character now, he would lose the 10 honest minutes a day when a woman named Betty called him honey and made him feel, briefly, like a man instead of a machine that owned things. "Yes, sir," said Alfera, eyes down. "I'll keep to my station." Curtis smirked, the generosity flowing back over his face like water closing over a stone, and walked away. He would remember that smirk. He would have a long time to remember it. The reckoning came the next day, and Alessandro had planned it clean and cold the Friday, all hands on the 4th floor, the whole executive layer in one room, Curtis at his most publicly beloved, Tomas, and 4 men in the lobby as auditors, the real forensic accountant, documents that were entirely, devastatingly real. But that morning, Curtis did the one thing Alessandro had not planned for. He came for Betty first. Alessandro heard it from the corridor, Curtis's voice raised in the cafeteria, and this time there was an audience, the whole lunch line, and Curtis had put the beloved mask back on, which made it worse. He'd sensed the vendor was under scrutiny, and in his panic he'd decided to get ahead of it by pinning the discrepancy on the one person no one would defend. "And I hate to do this. I really do." Curtis's voice was warm, regretful, reasonable, playing the crowd like an instrument. "But there's food unaccounted for. Company property. And I know, Betty. We all love Betty, but those containers going out the back door every week? That's theft, folks. I have to report it. It breaks my heart, but I have to." Betty had gone white. The containers, the shelter in Pilsen. He was going to take the single purest good she did in this world and file it as a crime, and he'd wrapped it in so much regret and warmth that half the line was already nodding, sympathetic to poor Curtis. Forced into this. "That food was going in the trash," Betty said, and her voice shook not with weakness but with the effort of holding it level. "I take it to a shelter, on my own time, Curtis. You've known that for years. And I always looked the other way, because I've got a soft heart." Curtis spread his hands to the crowd. "See how reasonable I am. But it's still company property, and now with the audit coming, I can't protect you anymore. I'm sorry. I really am. I think it's time we cleaned house, and it has to start somewhere. That's enough." The voice cut through the cafeteria like a blade through silk. It was quiet, it was calm, and it was completely, impossibly, unlike the voice of the old janitor. Every head turned. The man in the stained coveralls had straightened. The stoop was gone. He stood a full 4 inches taller than the shuffling figure they'd all trained themselves not to see, and something in the Arctic stillness of him made the whole room go cold at once. He reached up and drew the reading glasses from his face. The grey was still in his hair, the makeup still on his skin, but the eyes were suddenly, unmistakably, the eyes of a man accustomed to being obeyed by every living person in his path. "Curtis," said Alessandro Vitale, "you've stolen $2,412,000 from this company, over 11 months, through a shell vendor called Meridian Provisions. You billed for 240 catered lunches. My loading dock cameras recorded 80. You signed for all of them, with your own hand, 3 shells deep, On a card I'm holding a copy of right now. The blood went out of Curtis Dolan's face so fast it was almost theatrical. Who he managed. Who do you think you are? You're a... The cafeteria doors opened. Tomas walked in, silver-haired and immaculate in charcoal. 4 men behind him whose order to disguises turned out to be very thin indeed. Behind them came 2 of the building's real executives, faces grey with the dawning understanding of exactly who had been emptying their wastebaskets for 2 weeks. Tomas inclined his head, and his voice carried to every corner of the frozen room. Mr. Vitale, the documents are ready for your signature. Vitale. The name went through the cafeteria like a shockwave. Meridian Logistics, the Vitale Group, the name on the cornerstone, on every paycheck, the owner no one had ever laid eyes on. He had been mopping their floors. He had bent to pick up their trash. Curtis made a sound that wasn't a word. He looked at the janitor he'd threatened to throw down a stairwell, the man he'd called nobody, the man he'd been certain no one would miss, and understood, at last and far too late, whose building he had been robbing. Please, he whispered, and the beloved mask was gone now, cracked clean off, and underneath it was only a small and frightened man. Mr. Vitale, I didn't know, I didn't... No, Alessandro agreed. You didn't. That was the entire point. He walked toward Curtis slowly, and the crowd parted for him now. This man they had looked straight through, and not one of them would ever look through him again. You made the whole building love you so that no one would ever look at you closely. It was good work, Curtis. It nearly held. He stopped an arm's length away. But you revealed yourself to a man you were sure was powerless. Remember how that felt. Remember it exactly. It's the last honest thing you'll do for a long, long time. He nodded once. Tomas's men closed around Curtis Dolan and walked him out, and the shell company, the forged invoices, the doc footage, the signature card 3 layers deep, all of it would be handed clean and complete to the authorities, and Curtis would go to federal prison the lawful way, which for a man who had lived and breathed to be liked was a sentence far crueler than anything Alessandro could have done in a hallway. Then, in the ringing silence, Alessandro Vitale turned around and found Betty staring at him with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life. It was not awe. It was not the fear of the powerful. It was something that hurt him far worse than either. Betrayal. You, she said, very soft. You're the owner. Her eyes moved over him, the straightened spine, the terrible stillness, rereading every kindness she'd given him, and reframing all of it in this new and awful light, all this time. The chicken and dumplings. I gave you the good pot. Her voice fractured. I felt sorry for you. I thought you were a broke old man with nobody in the world, and I... She stopped, her jaw set hard. Was it funny, watching me fuss? The dumb cafeteria lady. So proud of her little kindnesses, and the whole time you were... Bettu, the richest man in the building, playing a part, letting me. She shook her head, and now the hurt was hardening into anger, which he understood was healthier and could not stand any better. I don't feel sorry for people so they can laugh at me later. It wasn't. No, she put up a hand, and the flower was still on it, and it stopped him more completely than any bodyguard ever had. Don't you stand there and explain it to me in that calm voice like I'm one of your problems to manage. Her eyes were wet now, and furious. You lied to my face every single day for 2 weeks and let me hand you my kindness like a fool. I don't care how many millions you've got, Mr. Vitale. That was a cruel thing to do to a person. And I've had about all the cruel I can take today. She untied her apron, set it on the counter with a care that was worse than throwing it, and walked out of her own cafeteria past the man who owned the building, and did not look back. Alessandro Vitale, who had never in his life had to chase anything, stood alone in the emptying room and understood that he had, for the first time, lost something that money could not recover. Tomas appeared at his shoulder, quiet. The car, sir? No. Alessandro was watching the door she'd gone through. Not the car. He let her go. That was the hardest thing, harder than the hallway, harder than the reveal. Every instinct he owned told him to fix it now, to send flowers that cost more than her house, to have the foundation lawyers draft something, to solve her the way he solved everything, with force and money and speed. And he understood, standing in that cafeteria, that every one of those instincts was exactly the thing she'd accused him of. She did not need to be managed. She needed to be left alone long enough to stop hurting, and then she needed something from him that he had never once given another living person. He needed to show up as himself, whoever that was. So he waited. 3 days. It was the longest 3 days he could remember, and he was a man who'd waited 11 months to catch a thief. On the 4th night, the shelter in Pilsen got a new volunteer for the dinner service. He was tall, quiet, graying at the temples, the makeup gone now, the prosthetic gone, so that he looked like nobody Betty had ever met and, at the same time, unmistakably like the old man who'd sat at her counter. He wore a plain grey Henley and jeans, and no watch at all, and he'd come in the back like everyone else, and asked the shelter coordinator where he could be useful. And she'd handed him an apron and a sink full of pots, and he had not said a word about who he was. Betty saw him from across the kitchen 20 minutes later, elbow deep in dishwater, scrubbing burnt rice off the bottom of an industrial pot, with the grim focus of a man who had clearly never done it before and was refusing to be bad at it. She stood very still for a moment. Then she walked over, dried her hands, and looked at him. "You don't belong here," she said. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't ice either. "No," Alessandro agreed. He didn't stop scrubbing. "I don't belong anywhere, mostly, but this is where you are, and I owe you something I couldn't say in that room." He set the pot down and turned to face her, and there was no calm executive stillness in him now, just a man with wet sleeves and something raw in his face. "I'm not going to explain it to you. You were right. That was cruel. There's no version of it that isn't. So I'm not here to make you understand. I'm here to say I'm sorry, and to wash your pots, and to keep washing them for as long as it takes you to believe I mean it. Weeks, months. I have the time." Betty crossed her arms. "You've got a mafia empire to run. I have people who run it. I'm told I'm actually somewhat in the way." The ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. "This is the first useful thing I've done with my hands in 20 years. She almost smiled. She caught it and put it away. "Not ready. Why'd you really do it? The uniform. And don't give me the thief. You could have caught your thief a dozen colder ways, a man like you." He was quiet a moment. The truth was a thing he'd told no one, ever, and he found he wanted to hand it to her the way she'd handed him the good pot, without knowing whether he'd get anything back. "Because everyone who has ever been kind to me," he said, "wanted something. In 20 years, Betty, not one person has been decent to me without knowing my name first. I put on that uniform because I was tired, not of the thief, of being invoiced. I wanted to know, one time, what it felt like to be a man instead of a threat." His voice dropped, and on the first day, a woman scraped the bottom of the good pot for a stranger who could never repay her, and called him honey, and told him he wasn't nothing. He looked at her. "You have no idea what you did. I didn't lie because I thought you were a fool. I lied because you were the only real thing I'd found in 20 years, and I was a coward about losing it. Those are different sins, but I'll own both." The kitchen was quiet around them, steam rising off the sink, the shelter's dinner clatter far away. Betty looked at him for a long moment, the long, Jen look, the one that made him feel transparent. "That poor old man," she said at last. "Quiet. He was real then. Some of him. All of him," Alessandro said. "He was the only part of me that was." She didn't forgive him that night. That mattered, that she made him earn it, that she didn't hand it over cheap. He washed pots until midnight and drove himself home, and came back the next night, and the night after, and Betty watched him do it. Watched the most feared man in Chicago show up in a plain shirt and scrub burnt rice, and learn the names of the shelter regulars and remember them, until slowly she began to understand that the man at her sink was not performing a kindness for an audience, that here, finally, was the one place Curtis Dolan's whole beloved empire of goodwill had been a lie, and this quiet billionaire's dishwater was the truth. The forgiveness, when it came the way she'd said everything real should, without speeches. He reached past her for a dish towel one night, 3 weeks in, and she rested a hand on his shoulder to move him aside, a small, percussive thing, 2 pats, there and gone, and neither of them said a word about it, and both of them knew. The Merino kitchen opened in Pilsen the following spring. A full commercial kitchen and dining hall built onto the shelter Betty had quietly fed for years, funded in perpetuity by a foundation that laundered nothing at all that was, in point of fact, the single cleanest thing Alessandro Vitale's money had ever touched. Betty ran it. She scraped the bottom of the good pot for anyone who walked through the door, and now the pot never ran empty. Curtis Dolan went to federal prison for wire fraud. He told anyone who'd listened that he'd been brought down by a janitor, and no one believed a word of it. On Thursday nights, if you happened to eat at the long table in that warm room, you might notice a tall, quiet man with graying hair at the far end. He didn't say much. He wore no watch worth more than the meal. He bussed his own tray and washed the pots when the line ran long, and when the woman who ran the place passed behind him, she'd sometimes rest a hand on his shoulder, 2 pats, there and gone. He had killed men. He had ordered worse. He owned half the skyline you could see through the window. But he had learned from a full-figured cook who kept a good pot back for the people the world called nothing, the one thing all his money and all his fear had never once been able to buy him. What it feels like to be seen all the way down and seen completely to be chosen anyway. The most powerful man in Chicago had gone hunting a thief. He'd found the only fortune that ever mattered instead. And every night, walking Betty to her car under the rain-bright Chicago streetlights, his hand at the small of her back like she was the most guarded thing in the city because to him, now, she was Alessandro Vitale, understood that the man in the janitor's uniform had never been a disguise at all. He'd been the beginning of the only true thing left. Somewhere in Pilsen tonight, a pot of soup is still warm, and a man who once had everything is scraping the bottom of it for a stranger who can give him nothing back. That's the whole secret, isn't it, that the kindest thing we ever do is often the thing we forget by morning, never knowing whose life it quietly saved. If Betty's good pot warmed something in you too, leave a like, so this story finds the next person who needs to be reminded that they matter. Subscribe if you want more stories that end where the real ones begin, and share this with the one person who was kind to you when you had nothing. And tell me, if you had been Betty, standing in that empty cafeteria, could you have forgiven him? The end